Sans plus tarder, nous allons accueillir Madame Camila, sciences cognitives de l'Université Pierre de Marie Curie en France, chercheuse et fondatrice du Centro de Estudio Laboratorio de Fenomenología Corporal au Chili. Madame Valenzuela sera accompagnée par sa collègue Madame Emma Demšar, que j'invite à partager leur écran et à prendre la parole dès maintenant. Et leur titre de conférence est Vers une science de l'expérience, esquisser quelques défis et orientations futures. Madame Valenzuela.
So thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you, Francisco, and all the organizing team. I'm aware of all the work that the organization of an event like this involves, so thank you very much. So in this talk, I would like to present some reflections that we have developed together with Emma Demšar, who is there, regarding the study of experience as an incipient discipline in the field of cognitive science. More particularly, we would like to share with you the identification of some open questions facing the study of experience that we believe are relevant to advance in the establishment of a coherent and consistent framework for the study of experience in the field of cognitive science. And also we would like to share a proposal, which is still under development, on how to address these challenges. This proposal consists on the one hand in reframing these open questions within the epistemological framework of the enactive approach, and on the other hand, to explore the prospect of gaining insight into the theoretical and methodological strategies for dealing with these issues beyond the field of cognitive science into the field of somatic practices. It might be important to clarify that the ideas that we'll be presenting, even if they cross theoretical and epistemological issues, they come mainly from our practical and empirical experience as researchers in the field of first-person research. Okay. Okay, so it is only a couple of decades ago that the cognitive science as a field has gradually opened up a space for the study of experience, motivated mainly by a difficulty facing the field to explain the conscious aspect of cognitive phenomena. We can consider that in the context of cognitive science, the study of experience as a discipline, it is can be considered as an offspring or a consequence of the enactive approach, since it was this alternative way of understanding cognition that opened up a space for the study of experience to be considered as a legitimate practice in cognitive science. This space was more explicitly claimed in the research program of neurophenomenology, developed by Francisco Varela, or proposed by Francisco Varela in 1996. Early neurophenomenological investigations contributed to the realization that in order to study any type of experience, it is a prerequisite to engage in the experiential act of becoming aware, revealing a fundamental aspect of the study of consciousness, its dynamic, transformative, and self-referential character. So by dynamic, we refer to the fact that what we are studying is not a static object that we can measure from different points of view or with different tools, but is in itself a process, is in itself something we do. With the transformative character, we refer to the fact that the fact of inquiring into experience transforms experience. So there is a movement there that we cannot avoid of transformation, and that we have to account for if we take seriously the enterprise of studying experience. And by the self-referential character, we mean that experience is both what is inquired into and also the process for inquiring it. So there is this circular feature that also we need to take into consideration when we think about of a science of experience. Okay, so several research groups adopted this proposal. So here, this is a very nice table that is published in a work of Berkovic and Ohana and collaborators. Berkovic, Ohana and collaborators. And we have a summary of different types of studies done within this neurophenomenological program. Also, this proposal contributes for the development and implementation of first-person methods. So, for instance, the microphenomenological interview and descriptive experience sampling. Although descriptive experience sampling, it doesn't emerge from this neurophenomenological move, but it has been used as a method in neurophenomenological studies. But we could say that for the most part, the peculiarities of researching experience, meaning the dynamic, transformative, and self-referential character, and what these features involve to think about on a science of experience have been overlooked. So the epistemological and methodological tension that a dialogue between an objectivist and a non-objectivist framework involves has often been solved by assuming the objectivist frame of reference to design and also to evaluate experiential research. So the study of experience has been maintained under the canons of scientific objectivism without the epistemological shift proposed by the enactive and the neurophenomenological programs. As many philosophers and researchers have pointed out in Contractivist Foundation. Now, I just put these images because they have very nice covers, but there are also other studies that point to the same issue. So we consider that in this context, first-person research has been constrained by a vital tension, meaning that it emerged from the recognition that the study of experience is essential for researching and understanding the phenomenon of consciousness, but was at the same time born in a field that has historically delegitimized the place of subjective experience in the generation of knowledge. Consequently, our current understanding of first-person research, its epistemic value, validation standards, and its place in the context of cognitive science is still lacking clarity and coherence. And we think that this lack of clarity, more particularly, is manifested in some open questions that we group under these three themes or challenges that cross methodological, but also theoretical and epistemological issues. So let's look first at the challenge of memory. So here we refer to the general question of how should we understand the process of recalling and relating to past experience, and what implication that this understanding have for the epistemology and validity of first-person research. So any first-person methodology have to deal with the fact that experience is described in retrospect, even when describing a very recent or just past experience. There is always a delay, no matter how small, that implies the gesture of observing, describing, and reflecting upon something that has already happened. This central aspect of the study of experience requires, although sometimes implicitly, an understanding of the phenomenon of memory that translate into methodological strategies as well as conceptual and epistemological questions. And so far, there is no clear frame or model for understanding what's going on when someone recalls and describes a past experience, which is reflected, for instance, in the way we respond to one of the criticism we receive as first-person researchers. Oh, sorry. Okay. So standard criticism to the study of experience is that we cannot access our past experiences with precision since we can distort them. However, this criticism implicitly assumes a representational approach, understanding memory as the recalling of events as they objectively happen. Defenders of first-person methods, even when they might not themselves subscribe to an objectivist view, have responded to this worry by arguing that their methods have specific tools to avoid these distortions to happen. For instance, minimizing the temporal gap between the experience and its examination, as in the case of descriptive experience sampling, or by cultivating the process of retrospection by relying on specific methodological tools that will avoid this possibility of distortion, such as the case of microphenomenology. However, it seems to us that this kind of response somehow validates the understanding of memory as the recalling of events, as recalling something that can be in fact objectively corroborated, which we think is inconsistent with epistemological principles that frame the study of experience, considering the enactive approach. Let's go now to the second set of open questions, grouping this challenge of expressing experience, that refers to the general question of how should we understand the relationship between experience and language, and how does that imply for the process of experience. So research on experience, as any kind of research, requires intersubjective validation. Therefore, although it is possible to conceive an inquiry into, for instance, one's own experience without the requirement to express the process and the outcome of that inquiry, practically, in the context of scientific research, there cannot be inquiry without expression or communication. Although in general terms, this requirement may seem quite simple and obvious, in practice, it opens up some complex questions for first-person research. For instance, researchers who have conducted first-person research might have faced the problem that different people show different abilities to describe their experience. These differences could be related to different abilities to get in touch with a given experience, different abilities to perform the reflective act, different ranges of linguistic expressions, or a combination of these different factors. An obvious question that arises is whether, and if so, how, these differences in the ability to describe experience relate to a potentially different ways of experiencing. Another practical issue is that many times concepts do not manage to grasp all the aspects of an experience. We encounter situations in which words fail to express a given experience or aspect of it, as we saw yesterday in the presentation of Sebastian Boros, that they were discussing the mystical experiences and how sometimes we lack words for describing them. And also the issue of metaphors. So many times when someone describes an experience, uses metaphors, and there are different types of metaphors, and there is no clear or unified position in the first-person methods of how to interpret them or how to analyze these metaphors, or which, if there is a clear divisory line between what will be a description using metaphors or not. So still there is an ambiguity or an unclear position from first-person research to how to deal or how to understand a more general question, which is how to understand the relationship between experience and language. which of course also is related to this other question of which is the relationship between expressing, for instance, between expressing and describing experience, as for the case of what do we do with metaphors, for instance. Okay, so now let's go to the third set of open questions related to this challenge of intersubjectivity that refers to the general question of how to understand the relational and participatory dimension of first-person research and take it into account in the understanding of research results. Okay, so the intersubjective dimension of studying experience is present throughout all the stages of the research process, starting with the very beginning of observing experience and acquiring data about it. So here, this is an image of an interview situation. So some of the most well-established first-person methods are based on interviews. So we have an interview setting with an interviewer through her questions is guiding the act of becoming aware of different aspects of our experience and being able to observe it and describe it. So already here there is a participatory dimension and an interaction between these two participants here and the whole situation, which somehow will determine the outcome of an interview, or what will be described. And also in the stage of the analysis of these interviews. So here I will show you that was done by a person who was doing an analysis, and this was the first impression of the interview she wrote. So she wrote the transcript and she drew the first impression of she got of this experience. And then this first drawing helped her throughout the whole analysis process to build, here we show a schema of the evolution, the temporal evolution of the experience that she was analyzing. So of course, this was a very talented drawing person, but we can also see, for instance, other types of schemes or drawing where the people who is analyzing is trying to make sense of the data they gather, and they try in different ways that are very personal for each person to organize, to categorize, and to finally make sense of the description of another. And this, of course, will be somehow determine the outcome of a research. And there is a subjectivity there also in the analysis process that somehow needs to be considered. And so far, there is still this implicit idea that the fact that the researcher actively participates in the whole analysis process, and also the subject actively participate in the examination of his own experience, this would mean somehow a bias. So there is still this belief that we see it manifested mainly in the validation procedure of this, of the observations and the results of the first-person research. So, for instance, the question of what, where, and whose is the unit of examination to which the results of first-person inquiry pertain. To what extent and in what way is the person whose experience is being investigated involved in the different stages of the research process, and to what extent should it be? And also for the case of the researcher. And so far, there is no clear procedure nor methodological guidelines to consider and to account for the dialogic relationship that's going on when we explore the experience of another. Okay, so now we go into the proposal. So what we propose to do in order to work towards the establishment of standards that allow a science of experience. So it's a proposal that has two parts. So the first part of this proposal is to reframe the challenges that I just described within the epistemological framework of the enactive approach. And of course, this is something that's not new. I mean, it's not something that we are like newly proposing. Even, I mean, the neurophenomenological proposal was already in its origin presented as a continuation of the enactive understanding of cognition. But somehow, for some reason, some principles that we consider crucial of the enactive approach that can help to frame a discipline of the study of experience has been somehow diluted. And we think that maybe one of the reasons why it has been diluted is precisely the lack of very pragmatical and methodological guidelines on how to deal with these very concrete issues. So that's the aim of this second part of this proposal, which is to look for insights into theoretical and methodological strategies for dealing with these issues and going outside the field of cognitive science, because we believe that the practices and validation standards of cognitive science are within this objectivist epistemology. So we need to go beyond to other fields that are consistent and aligned with this epistemology, with an active epistemological framework, to look for insights into how to examine how do they deal with these issues. And the field that we propose is the field of somatics. So let's look at first to the first part of this proposal. So I just said that, as I just said, the neurophenomenology was explicitly presented as a continuation of the enactive approach, as shown in this quote of Francisco Varela. But despite the fact that the neurophenomenological program was explicitly presented as a continuation of the enactive approach, some of the basic principles has been somehow, I don't know if forgotten, but very difficult to implement in practice. As you all well know, the enactive approach to cognition introduced the notion of enaction to propose an alternative way of understanding cognition and the relationship between the subject and its world. This understanding has some of its roots, as also you know, in the ideas developed by Maturana and Varela based on the analysis of living organisms as autopoietic systems. We would consider that their most radical contribution to the cognitive science can be considered the epistemological shift that involved the analysis of biological systems as autonomous and self-organized. And we would like to highlight three principles of this framework that we believe are key for framing the study of experience, and particularly for addressing the challenges that I just presented. And these principles are, well, the roots in the enactive approach, I just said that. So these principles are non-objectivism, non-reductionism, and the primacy of experience in the study of cognitive processes and in the generation of knowledge in a more general way. So taking these principles to the context of the study of experience, we can consider that they are reflected in how we can consider validation standards and also in how we understand the notion of experience. So for instance, the principle of non-objectivism provides an epistemological foundation that embraces the fact that there is not a third-person fixed objective reference point to which we can refer in order to validate our observations and results. Also, from these principles, we can consider that experience is something that we do. So experience is something that occurs in this relational space, in this relational domain of the whole subject with its environment and with others. And this, so understanding experience as something that we do, so as an action, as a behavior that pertains to this relational domain, it tells us, it talk about this dynamic character again, so the dynamic character of experience, of this movement of continuous transformation that is not something fixed that we can inspect as a static object. Okay, and this is something that we have to take into account when we think about a general frame for the study of experience. And the principle of the primacy of experience gives us a frame also to embrace the fact that it is always from our standpoint or our position as observers. So here this is an I, okay? It's always from our position as observers, which involves a subjectivity that we distinguish the phenomena around us and within us. And to bring the subjective distinctions, so in order to bring the subjective distinctions into a common scientific knowledge, it is required to establish intersubjective consensus or agreements, which is no different from any kind of research, actually, or science. That's not particularly for first-person research. So let's look now how this general epistemological umbrella is consistent with this field that I talked to you about, the field of somatics. So somatics refer to a group of different methods or somatic practices within the field of bodywork and movement studies, also called sometimes somatic education, that emphasize internal bodily perception and experience. As a field, somatics share some of the basic principles of the enactive framework outlined just before, and highlight the dynamic, transformative, and self-referential character of the study of human experience. Also, we consider somatics as a suitable pool of resources for a methodological and practical exploration for three main reasons. So the first one is that somatic practices are specifically interested in the human being as experienced from within. Through different techniques and exercises, somatic practices seek to broaden attentional capacity to allow the expansion of the range of volitional awareness and decrease conditioned responses. In this way, they provide tools for developing attentional and observational resources, and therefore for gaining acquaintance with embodied experience by the very act of becoming aware. As a consequence, somatic practices highlight the dynamic character of experience and of its study. As put forward by Thomas Hanna, somatics recognizes that self-observation is by nature a dynamic phenomenon, an act that changes the previous state of the organism. The human is not simply a self-conscious soma, passively observing itself. in addition to observing its scientific observer. But it's doing something else simultaneously. It is acting upon itself. That is, it is always engaged in the process of self-regulation. Also, in dealing with human experience in the context of physical and psychological health, somatic practices pragmatically address the challenges we just present, as we will see in a couple of seconds. So let's look at now how we could reframe the challenges within the epistemological framework of enaction, and also how could the field of somatics help in giving insights for the more practical methodological treatment of these issues. Okay, so regarding the challenge of memory, if we step outside the objectivist framework, an enactive understanding of remembering a past experience acknowledges that it is only from our present experiencing that we can relate to our past, which in fact is coherent with what we see in the interviews. If we understand experience as an active, dynamic, and embodied process that is constituted in a relational process between the individual and its environment, the assumption of events as objectively happen, independent of how they appear to the individual at a given moment, and in a given interaction, for instance, an interview situation, doesn't make sense. And the issue of to reframe as to what are the conditions that participate in the appearance of a given memory. However, this recognition needs to be accompanied by theoretical models and methodological strategies that are consistent with this general framework. So a promising start in this direction would be to examine, for instance, some contemporary accounts of memory that are compatible with an active approach, such as the phenomenological notion of body memory proposed by Thomas Fuchs. Also to look at some notions that have been already considered in first-person research, such as concrete memory, developed by Gusdorf. And in terms of the more practical, but maybe also theoretical approach to memory, we can consider somatic practices. So particularly, I will refer to a method called somatic experiencing, which is a method that deals particularly with traumatic experiences. And in this method, rather than being concerned with the narrative of the past experience that supposedly triggered the traumatic state, this method treats them by considering the individual's present experience. For our purpose, what is relevant to underline is that at all times, these methods work with what the person experiences in the present moment, assuming that whether or not the person remembers the event that generated the trauma, the individual embodies the meaning of the event or sets of events from the present moment. So we see that even if implicitly, this method has an understanding of the phenomenon of memory that considers experience as a dynamic process, which is consistent with an active perspective. Let's go now to the challenge of expressing experience. So under the enactive approach, language is understood as an embodied act, enabling us to understand the act of describing experience as part of its exploration, and therefore as part of the experience of becoming aware. Considering the biological roots of the enactive proposal, words are actions. And it is within language itself that the act of knowing brings forth a word. We realize ourselves in a mutual linguistic coupling, not because language allows us to say what we are, but because we are in language, in a continuous being in the linguistic and semantic worlds we bring to hand with others. Therefore, it can be considered that under the enactive understanding, the descriptive act reflects, or maybe even partially constitutes, the mode of expressing. It is important to note that the relationship between experiencing and describing is not static. Demšar, Varela, and Vermeer remind us that when carried out with a phenomenological attitude, examining experience is linked to the attempt at suspending our habitual presuppositions about experience. In the case of verbal expression, this includes suspending our habitual presuppositions about words. In other terms, in order to express our observations regarding experience, we are to suspend the habitual way we relate to words in order to let meaning arise in all its intensity, as they point. Following the understanding of language as an act, more than the actual word or concept that seem to be key for communicating experience is the performance of the act of suspension. This act might lead to non-verbal expressions, such as gestures, that can serve as an alternative or complementary way to help a person communicate her experience. Yeah, and so here I also refer to this distinction between speaking word and spoken word that we have discussed. I don't know if he's there, Sebastian Boros, introduced by Merleau-Ponty, which I think it can be very helpful in exploring these different ways of relating to our verbal description. So the speaking word will refer to this more embodied, fresh way to relate to description, in which, in connection with what we are experiencing, we try to enact our description so that it's remain fresh and close to embodied experience. And from what I understand, maybe then we can discuss that, the spoken word refers more to this sedimented use of language and use of words, where the word is already instituted and there is no need of checking whether this word is making sense or not, or whether this word is actually resonating with what I am experiencing. So it will be like this act of suspension that I was just talking about will be more related to this, to try to connect with this kind of wording, speaking word. Okay. Yeah, so I already say that. So somatic practices actually have a wide range of tools for dealing with these aspects of experience that are difficult to describe, or that we don't have words to describe, or that we don't remember. So they have tools to use alternative kind of language, such as plastic expression or movements, sounds, as an alternative, but also as a combination or as a way to help the transition to words. So for instance, these images here are pictures from a study we did with persons who suffer from fibromyalgia, and we use a combination of the microphenomenological interview with techniques of sensory awareness and drawing for the people to portray and express and describe their experiences. And they might as well serve as a way of expressing in itself, but also in the process of these women's doing their drawings, the description was somehow facilitated, or the description from this speaking position, from this suspending position. We can deepen into that in the discussion if it's not clear. Another example of the use of somatic practices in this regard is the use of gestures and body movements to serve as gateways to words. For instance, the study of Coulter and collaborators used body movements to provide experiential material for the generation of metaphors, which in turn helped in the transition from implicit body memory to explicit verbalized memory. Another somatic method that has developed a theory, actually, and pragmatic tools to frame the process of putting into words based on the development of sensory awareness is focusing, developed by a central aspect of this method is attending to what is called the felt sense. In the words of Gendlin, the felt sense is the holistic implicit bodily sense of a complex situation. It includes many factors, some of which have never been separated before. Despite its intricacy, the whole felt sense also has a focus, a single specific demand, direction, or point. In resonance to the idea of suspending the habitual way we relate to words, focusing offers tools to assist a person in the process called carrying forward. In this process, by being able to attend to the felt sense and accompany its form of manifestation, it is possible to find the words, phrases, or actions that resonate with it, allowing the process of meaning-making that moves the felt sense and orients it forward. These different examples suggest that the meaning carried by a given experience is embodied, but might not be readily expressible. Therefore, nonverbal, sensory, and expressive languages can help to unfold the act of becoming aware of such experiences in a way that they can be expressed and communicated. This can be accomplished both by using these alternative languages as means of expression and as means of facilitating the process of putting into words. Let's go to the last challenge, so the challenge of intersubjectivity. Okay. So from an enactive point of view, we could consider that the practice of science, as Nathalie Depran and Diego Cosmelli tell us, the practice of science as an experimental research program involves a social network of subjects working together. Thus, while still rigorous, scientific results are highly affected and dependent on intersubjective regulations at various levels of the research process. So in the field of somatic practices, contrary to what happens in a more objectivist framework, the issue of intersubjectivity is not actually considered as a problem. It is assumed that the process of becoming aware, or the process of gaining more sensorial awareness, is dependent on the process and on the interaction between the facilitator and the subject. So in their cases, it's not presented as an issue, but nonetheless, they are interested in this relational interaction, because it is assumed that it is from this relational process that the outcomes, so the type of outcome that we could have of an intervention will pretty much depend on what happens in this relationship. So they have developed tools to assess what's happening in this situation of practice of these different types of somatic practices. So for example, here the Kestenberg movement profile is a nonverbal instrument that helps to assess movement behavior and its related meaning in diagnosis, therapeutic, and also in research context. Interestingly, for addressing the issue of intersubjectivity, this study performed by Somatics used this method in the context of shared movement, which is a dance psychotherapeutic intervention, and they analyze the movement aspects that are involved in interpersonal kinetic engagement. A different example of the vocalization silence dynamic patterns, which is a tool to account for vocal coordination patterns in psychotherapeutic conversation, to examine the association between interactional coordination and positive relational outcomes. So these are just a few examples of the possibilities for investigating the intersubjective nature of interpersonal encounters, such as those that occur in the context of first-person research, the result of which can be integrated to more fully account for the multiple factors involved in experiential research. So arriving to the end. So just as, closing remarks. So if we consider to walk towards what we consider a science of experience, it is necessary to address this issue that we presented here from this enactive point of view, but mainly what we think that is relevant is to look at the way we frame the whole process of validation. So how we establish this standard and validation criteria, because I don't know if you noticed, but all these open questions, in fact, are manifested when we want to, when it comes to the issue of validation. So together with reframing these open questions within an enactive perspective, it is necessary to do a whole work between the community of researchers and philosophers and that are interested and working in the field to establish these standards and as Varela was putting it, this challenge of transforming the culture, the scientific culture. So it's not only a question of reframing in theory, and also looking for practical methodological strategies, but also to generate this movement of to think together, what does it mean for science to push these boundaries? And of course, it is necessary to practically and specifically look to examine which strategies can be considered to address the different challenges we presented. We just mentioned some examples that could help, but the work still needs to be done to see whether which specific strategies can be used, how these strategies can be coherently combined under a theoretical framework that is consistent with the enactive approach, and whether and how they can be transposed to a research context, because somatics practices by themselves, they don't have the aim of being considered in a research program, although there is research being done using them. But so all this work, still need to be done. And in our lab and together with Emma Demšar, we are in this project of trying to walk in this direction. So thank you very much, and all your questions are very welcome. Thank you for your attention.